Close your eyes and imagine yourself walking down a narrow cobblestone street at night, the air heavy with the smell of smoke and damp stone, the distant sound of bells echoing across a valley. A faint glow comes from torches mounted along the rough wooden walls of an old town, and through that glow you glimpse shadowy figures in cloaks moving silently together in a hall built of timber and stone. This is not the modern world of neon lights and highways, but a world centuries past, a place where parchment scrolls, wax seals, and the whispered word of a ruler held the power of life and death. It is here, in these hushed chambers of medieval power, that laws were born, laws that shaped society and bound men and women to a code of order. Some of those laws disappeared with the centuries, washed away by revolutions, reforms, and the march of progress, but astonishingly, some did not. A few strange remnants of that long-gone age still survive, quietly nestled in the framework of modern life, waiting to be discovered by anyone curious enough to peer beneath the surface of history. When you think of the Middle Ages, your mind might wander to images of knights in shining armor, kings seated on thrones beneath vaulted ceilings, or peasants bending over fields in the cold dawn. But alongside those images was another force, less dramatic perhaps but far more enduring: the law. The law was not simply a set of rules written on paper, for much of the population could not read, and parchment itself was rare and precious. Instead, the law was alive, carried in memory, spoken aloud in crowded squares, enforced in ceremonies that felt more like rituals than judgments. Imagine standing shoulder to shoulder in a marketplace as a town crier announces the latest decree, his voice cutting through the chatter of the crowd. That decree was not just information, it was power woven into daily life, and it could decide who kept their land, who lost it, who paid a fine, or who was led to punishment. The strange thing is that in a quiet corner of today's legal systems, one such decree still lingers, preserved like an ancient fossil embedded in stone. It is almost impossible to believe. How could a law written in a world of castles and cathedrals, of feudal lords and wandering monks, survive the rise of printing presses, the collapse of monarchies, the thunder of revolutions, the invention of electricity, and the complexities of modern democracy? Yet the past has a way of leaving its fingerprints where you least expect it. As you listen, you may begin to sense how time folds back upon itself, how the boundaries between centuries blur, and how an ancient voice can still whisper into the present. The law in question is not one of the great sweeping declarations that changed kingdoms overnight. It is not Magna Carta or a royal edict that redrew the boundaries of empires. No, it is quieter, stranger, and because of that, perhaps more fascinating. Before revealing it, let the imagination linger in the uncertainty. Picture the ink-stained hand of a medieval scribe bent over a wooden desk, copying a decree by candlelight. The words he writes may seem mundane, perhaps even trivial, but those words will outlive him by hundreds of years. They will outlive the kings and queens whose names they invoke. They will survive plague, famine, and war, clinging stubbornly to the fabric of society long after everyone has forgotten why they were written in the first place. That is the mystery that will guide us. Not just the law itself, but the strange persistence of it. As you breathe slowly and deeply, allow yourself to drift into this world. The torches flicker, the voices murmur, and the great machinery of medieval justice stirs to life. The people in that world do not know you are watching, and yet you can see them clearly. You can see the guards in chainmail, their helmets catching the firelight, the clerks hunched over ledgers, the nobles seated with stern expressions. You can hear the faint scratching of quills, the rustle of parchment, the clink of coins exchanged as fines are paid or taxes collected. This is the texture of medieval law, woven from the lives of ordinary people and the ambitions of the powerful. In a moment, the specific law will be named, and its story will unfold. But for now, rest in the knowledge that history is not always buried. Sometimes it sleeps lightly, waiting for curious minds to awaken it. Somewhere, even today, there exists a strange thread connecting our world of modern courts and legislation back to those dimly lit chambers. It is that thread we will follow together, gently, patiently, until the mystery reveals itself in full. Close your eyes and let your imagination wander deeper into the fabric of the medieval world, a place where the very idea of law felt different from the systems we take for granted today. In our modern lives, laws are written in thick books, interpreted by judges in quiet courtrooms, and enforced by governments bound to constitutions. They exist as something abstract, removed from daily rituals, carried forward by institutions and procedures. But in the Middle Ages, law was something far more immediate, far more tangible, and often far more intimidating. It was not simply a matter of codes and statutes, it was a living force, woven into the rhythm of life, expressed in symbols, ceremonies, and punishments that could terrify and astonish in equal measure. To understand how a strange medieval law could still survive today, you must first step into this different reality, where the boundaries between justice, religion, and raw power blurred until they were nearly indistinguishable. Imagine yourself standing in the courtyard of a castle. Around you, banners flutter in the wind, each bearing the mark of a ruling lord. On one side, villagers gather anxiously, their faces weathered from long days in the fields. On the other, armored men stand tall and silent, their swords gleaming at their sides, serving as reminders that the authority of the law was backed not only by parchment but by steel. At the center, beneath a wooden canopy, a figure sits high above the crowd, robed and stern, perhaps a lord or a judge sent by the crown. This figure is not only a dispenser of justice but also a symbol of order in a world often fraught with chaos. People listen, hearts pounding, as decrees are read aloud. Some are practical, concerning land rights, taxes, or obligations to the manor. Others are rooted in tradition, shaped by superstition and faith, designed as much to maintain order as to remind subjects of who held power over their lives. The medieval world was not uniform in its laws. In one region, a custom might hold sway, passed orally from one generation to the next, enforced through memory and tradition rather than any written record. In another, royal charters or edicts could suddenly override local customs, binding subjects to new rules regardless of whether they understood or agreed with them. Law was a patchwork, stitched together from overlapping sources of authority: the church, the crown, local lords, and ancient practices that no one could quite trace back to their origin. A villager might fear both the priest who threatened spiritual damnation for breaking divine laws and the bailiff who demanded payment for breaking the Lord's laws. The two forms of authority intertwined, reinforcing one another, making the law both sacred and secular, both spiritual and political. What made medieval law so strange to our modern eyes was its reliance on spectacle. Justice was not hidden in sealed rooms or technical documents. It was performed in front of people, designed to be remembered, feared, and retold. When someone was accused of theft, they might not be tried with witnesses and written evidence but through ordeals by fire or water, their fate determined by whether they could hold a hot iron without burning or sink beneath the surface of a river. These practices were not viewed as barbaric by those who lived then. Rather, they were seen as divine tests, ways in which God Himself revealed truth. In that sense, the law was inseparable from belief. To break the law was not only to offend the ruler but also to challenge the divine order of the world. And yet, alongside this harshness, there was also a surprising degree of formality and ritual. Many medieval laws were recited aloud in specific rhythms, almost like chants, so that they could be memorized and preserved in a largely illiterate society. Judges and clerks often wore garments that distinguished them, turning the enforcement of law into a kind of theater. Trials, punishments, and proclamations became performances that taught the crowd what was acceptable and what was forbidden. For peasants who had little else in the way of entertainment or communal gathering, these moments could feel as striking as a festival or a religious procession, though their message was darker: remember who rules, and remember the cost of disobedience. If you lived in that time, the law was never something distant. It touched nearly every aspect of your existence. From the way you paid your taxes, to the land you could till, to the obligations you owed your lord, to the way you prayed and married and even buried your dead, rules structured the cycle of life and death. To us, such rules might feel suffocating, arbitrary, or bizarre. But for people then, they gave shape to a world that often seemed unpredictable. Famine, plague, war, and uncertainty loomed over daily life, and the law, however strange, offered a sense of order, a rhythm to hold onto amidst the chaos. When you compare this with modern systems, the difference is almost dizzying. Today, we see law as something impersonal, designed to be objective, upheld by reason and evidence rather than ritual and fear. In the Middle Ages, law was never impersonal, it was always embodied. It came with the voice of the crier, the presence of the judge, the sight of soldiers, the approval of priests, and the shadow of kings. It was rooted in culture and ceremony as much as in practical governance. That is why certain laws, though strange to us, could endure for so long. They were not merely rules, they were woven into the very identity of communities, repeated, remembered, and reenacted until they became impossible to erase completely. And this is where the seeds of our mystery begin to take root. Somewhere in the tangle of medieval codes, rituals, and decrees, a law was written that had little reason to survive yet still managed to do so. It traveled quietly across the centuries, carried forward by habit, by inertia, by tradition, until it stands before us today, like a forgotten relic left in the corner of a modern room. To grasp why this is so astonishing, you must first recognize how alien the medieval world of law truly was, at once harsh and ceremonial, rooted in fear yet rich with meaning, both deeply personal and profoundly symbolic. And it is from this strange landscape that the law in question emerged, a law that lingers in the background of modern life, a reminder that history never fully lets go of us. Think of how a mystery unfolds, not with sudden revelations but with slow hints, soft clues that invite you deeper and deeper into curiosity. In the last moments you have walked through the atmosphere of medieval justice, seen the torches, heard the proclamations, and felt the closeness of the law to everyday life. Now, within that strange tapestry, one law emerges as a thread unlike any other, a thread so unusual that it has survived centuries without unraveling. But before its name is spoken, allow the imagination to dwell in the strangeness of such endurance. Many laws of that age disappeared quickly, erased when new rulers ascended or when revolutions swept aside the old order. Yet this law, neither grand nor central, somehow remained, surviving almost unnoticed, as though history forgot to wash it away. Picture yourself in the middle of a crowded medieval town square, the people buzzing with nervous energy. The crier steps forward, unrolling a scroll and declaring words that at first sound ordinary, yet the more they echo, the more peculiar they become. The townspeople listen, some nodding as though they already knew of it, others glancing at each other with puzzled looks. This is how it began, a law that seemed ceremonial, even trivial, in its early days. To many it might have been no more than a formality, one among dozens of pronouncements that structured life. And yet it had a quality that clung to memory. Perhaps it was the ritual attached to it, perhaps the odd logic behind it, or perhaps the simple fact that it was repeated so often it began to take root like folklore. The law in question is not about kings seizing land or armies marching into battle. It is not about taxes or crimes of blood. Instead, it is about something strangely specific, a regulation that feels more like a ritual than a statute. Imagine the faint absurdity of rules that dictated how animals must be driven through the town, or how bread must be baked and weighed, or how obligations to the crown must be performed not only in deed but also in precise symbolic gesture. Such details, so small in the grand scheme of medieval life, often seemed like curiosities. Yet one of these curiosities outlived all expectation. This law, though small, carried layers of meaning. To the people of its time, it was not ridiculous. It was a demonstration of loyalty, of hierarchy, of the sacred order of society. And because it was repeated in ritual and ceremony, because it wove itself into the habits of generations, it refused to fade away even as centuries rolled forward. Picture the monks in quiet scriptoria, carefully copying the words, ensuring the law remained on record. Picture the local courts, invoking it not daily but occasionally, just enough to keep it alive. Imagine how strange it must feel for us, centuries later, to realize that the parchment written in candlelight still whispers into our age of computers and satellites. And so the strangeness deepens. Consider how many laws from that era were bound up with ordeals, with punishments that would horrify us now, with customs that feel cruel or alien. They were swept aside as the Enlightenment dawned, as reason began to replace ritual. But this one did not vanish. It lingered quietly, never prominent enough to spark outrage, never central enough to inspire reform. It survived because it lived in the margins, hidden in the folds of history where reformers' eyes rarely glanced. And now, in the present day, it can still be found, still technically valid, though rarely spoken of. Think of the sheer improbability of it. When nations shifted their legal codes, when monarchies fell and democracies rose, when empires expanded and collapsed, this law remained like a stone at the bottom of a rushing river, untouched by the currents. Its very strangeness protected it. Where great laws were challenged and rewritten, this one was overlooked, its oddity making it seem harmless. And so it endured, passing through ages that would have seemed unimaginable to the men who first heard it proclaimed. As you listen now, you may feel the tension of curiosity tightening. What exactly does this law say? Why has it lasted? Soon, its wording will be revealed, and with it a story that connects our modern world to the flickering torches of the medieval past. But for this moment, allow yourself to rest in the sense of wonder, the slow unraveling of a mystery that bridges nearly 1,000 years. A law unlike any other waits just beyond the horizon of memory, still alive, still binding, a whisper from the past that has somehow survived to speak into the present. Picture a world where kingdoms were fragile, where power shifted with the death of a king or the rise of a rival, where the landscape itself seemed carved into a patchwork of loyalties and feuds. In this world, a single law could be born not merely from logic or governance but from ceremony, ritual, and the need to remind people of the order of things. The strange medieval law that survived into our age began its life in such a moment, not as a sweeping reform or a mighty declaration but as a product of context, of fear, of necessity, and of imagination. To understand its birth, you must step into the year when it was first proclaimed, a year when the people believed the unseen world was just as real as the tangible one, when symbols held as much weight as swords, and when rulers leaned on ritual to keep their authority secure. Imagine the scene of its first declaration. A hall stretches wide with wooden beams darkened by smoke. Torches cast flickering shadows against the walls, where banners bearing the crest of a ruling family hang solemnly. At the far end sits the lord or king, his expression grave, flanked by clerics who murmur prayers and scribes who ready their quills. Before him stand villagers, townsmen, perhaps even lesser nobles, all waiting to hear the words that will shape their obligations. The hall is hushed, but there is an energy in the air, the kind that comes when something new is about to be added to the rhythm of life. The herald steps forward, unrolls a parchment, and in a loud, steady voice reads aloud the law for the first time. The words echo, and those gathered do not merely hear them, they absorb them, aware that these sounds mark the birth of something that will live on beyond them. The question is, why this law, why now? The medieval world was full of shifting tensions. Lords feared rebellion from their subjects. Kings feared betrayal from ambitious barons. The church demanded its place, reminding rulers that spiritual power often outweighed earthly crowns. And the people themselves needed order, a framework to cling to in times of famine, war, and disease. This law, strange though it might seem to us, was born from those needs. It offered not only a practical function but also a symbolic one. It reminded the people of their place, reassured rulers of their control, and satisfied the cultural hunger for ceremony and ritual. Consider the role of the church in its creation. Medieval laws were rarely crafted in isolation from faith. Priests and bishops were often present when decrees were declared, lending the weight of divine approval to human rulings. This law was no exception. Its wording carried hints of ritual language, phrases that resonated not only in the courts of men but also in the minds of those who believed the heavens watched over every oath and decree. In its earliest form, the law was less about punishment and more about performance. It was about being seen to uphold order, about creating a moment where everyone, from the poorest peasant to the noblest knight, felt the boundaries of society reinforced. The law's birth also reveals something important about medieval rulers. They were not secure, not in the way modern governments are. Their authority depended on constant reminders, on shows of strength, on rituals that tied their subjects to them. This law was one such reminder, a binding thread that said, "The ruler is here, the hierarchy is real, and you, the subject, must never forget it." That is why the proclamation of the law was accompanied by spectacle. Bells might have rung, processions might have followed, and punishments for disobedience might have been displayed publicly to etch the lesson deeper into memory. For those who stood in that hall on the day of its birth, the law was not a curiosity. It was a serious, even sacred, addition to their lives. Think of the scribes copying its words into the records, their quills scratching slowly on parchment. They may not have known they were preserving something that would endure for centuries, but in their careful script they gave it life beyond the moment. The parchment would be stored in a chest, guarded in a church, or filed in the records of a castle. Other copies would be made, traveling with judges and clerks, until the law took root in places far beyond the hall of its birth. Each time it was read aloud in a village square, each time it was cited in a dispute, it grew stronger, not just as a rule but as a tradition, something that belonged not only to the ruler but to the culture itself. What is most striking about its origin is the blend of practicality and symbolism. The law solved a problem of its time, whether that problem was about property, allegiance, or ritual duty. But it also did something more subtle. It reassured people. In a world where life expectancy was short, where war could sweep through a village overnight, where famine could erase a generation, stability was as precious as gold. Laws like this one gave the illusion of permanence, the sense that while life might be uncertain, the structure of society held firm. That illusion was powerful enough to make the law last long after its original purpose had faded. And so, as centuries turned, the law's birth became a story retold, not in history books but in practice. It was not remembered as a single moment frozen in time but as a ritual repeated, a custom upheld, a parchment preserved. The men and women who first heard it proclaimed could never have imagined that their descendants, hundreds of years later, would still technically live under its shadow. Yet that is the legacy of its creation. Born in a hall filled with smoke and whispers, guided by both ruler and priest, carried forward by ceremony and memory, the law set out on a journey that would outlast thrones, empires, and revolutions. Its birth was humble, even peculiar, but like many things in history, it is the peculiar that proves most enduring. Imagine the scene after the law was first spoken into existence, not merely as words on parchment but as a living performance that the people could see, hear, and remember. In the medieval mind, law was not only enforced in courtrooms or whispered in council chambers, it was staged, woven into the pageantry of daily life so that its power could not be doubted. The rituals and ceremonies tied to this law were as important as the law itself, for they transformed an abstract rule into an unforgettable moment etched in the memory of the community. To hear about a law was one thing, but to see it acted out with solemn gestures, with symbols and processions, was another entirely. It made the authority of rulers tangible, visible, and undeniable, and it gave ordinary people something they could carry in story and memory long after the parchment faded. Picture a town square in the early hours of morning, the bells of the church tolling slowly as villagers gather, pulling their cloaks tight against the cold. At the center, a raised wooden platform has been built, decorated with banners and guarded by men in chainmail. Upon it stand clerks with scrolls, officials robed in long garments, and perhaps even a priest holding a cross aloft. The reading of the law is not done quietly but with ceremony. A herald steps forward, his voice carrying across the square, each word carefully enunciated as though the syllables themselves were sacred. Behind him, gestures and symbols reinforce the message, a chest opened to reveal relics, a torch raised high to symbolize truth, or perhaps an animal brought forth as part of a ritual demonstration. For medieval people, spectacle gave meaning to authority, and so the law was always accompanied by these gestures, ensuring no one forgot the weight it carried. The rituals attached to the law could be strange to modern eyes. They might involve oaths sworn on relics, hands placed upon sacred objects, or symbolic acts performed to seal obedience. Sometimes the ceremony might seem almost theatrical, a drama meant to impress upon the crowd the seriousness of the moment. Imagine a nobleman kneeling before the gathered assembly, repeating the words of loyalty required by the law while touching the altar. Imagine townsmen required to bow their heads as the herald's voice proclaimed the obligations they must uphold. Even punishments tied to the law were often staged in public, not behind closed doors, because the visibility of justice mattered as much as its outcome. The performance was the point, for only through spectacle could the law become real in the eyes of the people. The use of ceremony also reinforced hierarchy. Everyone had their place, from the lord who sat in judgment to the clerics who sanctified the proceedings, to the townsfolk who listened and obeyed. By watching the ritual unfold, each person was reminded where they stood in the great chain of medieval society. The law was not simply a statement of rules, It was an enactment of order, a living display that made abstract authority concrete. And because these ceremonies were repeated year after year, generation after generation, they carved grooves into the culture. To see them was to remember them, and to remember them was to pass them on. Sometimes the rituals even crossed into the realm of the uncanny, tinged with superstition. A bell might be rung at a particular point in the proclamation, its toll believed to drive away evil spirits that could interfere with justice. A flame might be carried around the crowd, symbolizing purity and divine witness. The law's announcement might be followed by feasting or solemn fasting, so that the moment became part of the community's rhythm of life. In such ways, law became inseparable from belief, ritual, and daily existence. What we might dismiss as unnecessary pomp was, to them, a necessary reinforcement of truth and order. Imagine yourself standing there, watching it all unfold. The herald's voice rises and falls, the priest lifts a hand in blessing, the crowd murmurs assent. The children peer wide-eyed, not fully understanding but absorbing the atmosphere, while the elders nod gravely, knowing that the same ceremony was performed in their youth. In that moment, the law is no longer distant or abstract, it is alive, woven into the lives of the people. The villagers return to their homes, carrying the memory of the day, telling the story to those who could not attend, and in doing so, spreading the authority of the law far beyond the square. What is striking is how these ceremonies turned something fragile into something lasting. A parchment could be lost, a decree could be forgotten, but a ritual enacted before hundreds of witnesses planted itself in memory and culture. This is perhaps one of the reasons the law survived so long. Its words lived not only in archives but also in stories, in habits, in the expectation that ceremonies would be performed again and again. Each repetition was a renewal, a reminder that even if the world around them shifted, the law still stood. In this way, ritual acted as a kind of preservation, keeping alive what might otherwise have faded into obscurity. There is also a gentler side to consider. Though ceremonies could be heavy with authority, they also provided a sense of unity. Villagers who gathered together for the proclamation shared an experience, one that gave shape to the rhythm of their year. For many, it was one of the few times when everyone, regardless of station, stood side by side in recognition of a common rule. They may not have enjoyed it, and some may have feared it, but they could not deny its role in binding them together under the same authority. In a time when life was uncertain, such rituals created stability. As you let these images settle in your mind, think of how unusual it is that these ceremonies echo faintly even now. The law they enshrined is still alive, still technically binding, though its rituals have faded into history. Yet if you listen closely, you can almost hear the bells tolling, the herald's voice carrying across the square, the collective murmur of assent rising from the crowd. What was once a performance in torchlight has become a ghost of memory that lingers in the framework of modern law. It is through ritual, through spectacle, through the deliberate act of making rules visible, that this strange medieval law found its strength, a strength that allowed it to cross centuries and reach us in the present. The endurance of this law into the modern age is not only a matter of written preservation but also of how institutions continued to weave it into their daily functions, often without questioning its origins. For centuries, legal customs built on layers, one rule set upon another, until the foundation became almost invisible. What began as a medieval pronouncement wrapped in ritual survived because it was folded quietly into charters, oaths, contracts, and precedents. When judges cited it, they did not pause to remember the herald's voice or the torches in the square. They cited it as if it had always been there, an unquestionable part of the legal fabric. Over time, the theatricality faded, but the words remained, stripped of their ceremony yet no less powerful. This is one of the mysteries of law, that something born in spectacle can continue in silence, surviving not because people recall its origin but because it has become so normal that no one thinks to challenge it. Picture a courtroom centuries later, no longer open squares filled with banners and bells but enclosed halls lined with wooden books. A barrister rises, wig powdered white, and cites a statute whose roots stretch back to that medieval proclamation. The judge nods, the precedent accepted without hesitation, and the case proceeds. No villager remembers the ritual, no priest holds up a relic, no herald shouts to the crowd, but the effect is the same. The law binds, obliges, and determines lives. The chain of memory has shifted from spectacle to parchment, from collective performance to professional repetition. The transition is so subtle that generations hardly noticed it, yet through this very subtlety, the law endures. What was once embodied in public ritual becomes embedded in institutional practice, and institutions are among the hardest things to dismantle. The survival also owes itself to the strange human tendency to revere antiquity. When people encounter an old rule, there is often an instinct to protect it, to see in it the wisdom of forebears, even if no one remembers the exact reasons it was created. In this sense, the law's medieval strangeness became an asset, for its age lent it a certain authority. To repeal it would feel like severing a tie to history, and so it persisted. The parchment bore dust, the words grew archaic, but the reverence for what was ancient gave it legitimacy. Judges, lawmakers, and scholars looked at it not as an odd relic to be discarded but as a foundation stone upon which more modern laws could rest. This quiet respect shielded it from erasure. It is fascinating to imagine how many people lived their entire lives bound by it without ever knowing its origin. Farmers who signed contracts, merchants who swore oaths, rulers who issued decrees, all were touched by the long shadow of a ritual their ancestors once watched in a square centuries before. The law became like a river underground, unseen but feeding wells and fields above. And when occasionally it surfaced, perhaps in an obscure trial or a ceremonial reference, it reminded people that they were standing in the presence of something ancient. Such moments were rare, but they carried immense symbolic weight, connecting the present to a distant past. The endurance of the law was also practical. It was adaptable, able to bend without breaking, to be cited in different ways as society changed. In one era, it might justify a monarch's decision; in another, it might be invoked to protect the rights of townsfolk. Its vagueness became its strength, for it allowed people to interpret it in ways that suited their needs. Laws that are too rigid often snap when the world changes, but this one had enough ambiguity to remain useful across centuries. Each generation found in it what it needed, and in doing so, kept it alive. This adaptability is part of why modern courts still sometimes reference laws whose origins lie in centuries-old parchment. They endure not because they are perfect but because they are pliable. The irony is that the rituals that once gave the law its life were forgotten, yet they were the very reason it survived in the first place. Without the spectacle, the law might never have been remembered long enough to be copied and cited. Without the ceremonies, the words might have been dismissed as just another decree, lost among thousands of forgotten rules. It was precisely because the law was staged so dramatically that it lodged itself in memory, and from memory into tradition, and from tradition into the institutions that still govern us. The performance has vanished, but the echo remains in the very structure of the law today. Now consider the modern world, where the idea of such rituals seems almost absurd. Imagine a government today announcing a new law with bells tolling, torches burning, and priests lifting relics. It would be seen as theater, perhaps even as a parody. Yet in the medieval world, that was the only way to make law real. The fact that the substance of the law has survived into an age where ritual is unnecessary shows just how powerful those original performances were. They carried the law across a bridge of centuries, from a society that believed in spectacle to one that believes in paper and precedent. The journey is extraordinary, a testament to the durability of human customs once they take root. What lingers most strongly is the image of continuity. The same words that once rang across a medieval square are now muttered in modern courts, often without recognition of their origin. The community that once bowed its head in the cold morning is long gone, yet the descendants live under the shadow of the same rule. This continuity is what makes the law more than just words. It is a chain linking generations, binding the living to the dead, carrying forward the decisions of ancestors into the present. In that sense, the law is not just a survival of parchment but of memory, of ritual transformed into habit, of spectacle transformed into tradition. Perhaps the strangest thought is that we too are part of this chain. By speaking of the law, by recalling its rituals, by marveling at its survival, we extend its life. Even in a world of technology and modernity, we find ourselves haunted by the echoes of bells and torches, by the presence of a herald's voice that no longer sounds yet somehow still resonates. The endurance of this law is not just legal, It is cultural, emotional, and historical. It shows that once something is woven into the fabric of human life, it is incredibly difficult to unpick, no matter how strange its origin may seem to us now. And so the law stands, half forgotten yet ever present, stripped of its spectacle yet clothed in authority. Its endurance is a story not of dusty parchment but of living continuity, of how humans, without realizing it, carry the past forward into the present. It is a reminder that law is never just words, but always performance, memory, and survival, and that the rituals we think unnecessary today may be the very things that allow our own rules to endure for centuries to come. Imagine walking through a medieval marketplace where voices rise like a chorus, merchants calling out their wares, coins clinking, the smell of bread and smoke filling the air. Among the noise, hidden in the routine of trade and daily bargaining, the strange law quietly plays its part. To us it may seem like a relic, an oddity that belongs in books, but for those who lived in that world it was a thread woven into their daily existence. The law touched property exchanges, oaths of loyalty, disputes between neighbors, and even the sacred rituals that marked life from birth to death. It was not just a proclamation in a hall or a parchment in a chest, it became a living force that ordinary men and women had to contend with, sometimes without ever realizing how old or peculiar its origins truly were. Picture a farmer working a strip of land, handed down from his father and grandfather. When he seeks to pass it on to his son, he must observe the rule that still lingers from that medieval decree. Perhaps he must make a symbolic act, a token payment, a gesture that seems strange even to him but is accepted because it is tradition. Imagine a bride and groom at their wedding, repeating vows that include words shaped by the same ancient law, words that connect not only two people but also a lineage of practice stretching back centuries. These everyday rituals, so small and ordinary, carried within them the echo of the original proclamation. Without grand ceremony, the law still spoke through these acts, as though whispering its presence in the background of life. Merchants in towns also felt its weight. Trade was growing, markets were bustling, and agreements had to be kept clear to prevent disputes. The law, though odd, provided a common ground. A contract might be sealed not only with ink and handshake but with an act that outsiders would find strange. Yet within the community, everyone knew it had meaning. It bound the transaction, made it legitimate in a way that ordinary words could not. For the merchant, this was not just superstition but a guarantee. The ritual gave weight to his deal, and if trouble arose, the courts would recognize the act as valid. Thus, the law infiltrated commerce, attaching itself to the rhythm of trade, giving the strange the appearance of normal. What made it endure in daily life was how ordinary people adapted it. They did not cling to its full original form, with priests and processions, but they preserved fragments of it in gestures and sayings. A villager might repeat a phrase from the law without knowing its full meaning, simply because it was what his father had said before him. A town council might insist on a ritual step in a contract without being able to explain why, only because it had always been done that way. In this way the law became less of a command and more of a habit, a custom that people performed almost automatically. That is how laws survive best, not as orders written in stern language, but as practices absorbed into the bones of daily life. There were, of course, those who found it strange even then. Imagine a traveler from another land, witnessing the ritual for the first time, puzzled at why people would cling to such odd forms. Yet for the locals it was unquestionable, a reminder that their community was unique, bound together by rules others might not understand. That sense of identity, of belonging to something that had roots in ancient times, made the law not just a burden but a source of quiet pride. People saw in it continuity, a reassurance that no matter how the world changed, some things endured. That reassurance had value in a world where life was fragile and uncertain. Even disputes and conflicts bore the law's mark. When neighbors argued over land boundaries, when inheritance tore families apart, when merchants clashed over debts, the law could be invoked as authority. Judges or elders would repeat its words, citing its power, and the dispute would often settle because both sides respected the old tradition. It was not always fair, and not everyone benefited equally, but it carried enough weight to restore order. In this way, the law was not only ritual but also tool, used by communities to settle quarrels and restore peace. Think of how many generations lived with it, never questioning its strangeness. A boy grew into a man, repeated the gestures his father had taught him, and taught them again to his son. A woman followed the ritual in her marriage, not because she understood its medieval roots, but because everyone around her did the same. Whole lifetimes passed under its shadow, and as centuries rolled on, the law became so natural that to live without it would have seemed more strange than to live with it. That is the true power of continuity, that what once began as an extraordinary spectacle becomes an ordinary act, indistinguishable from the rest of life. And yet, within these daily acts, the law retained something almost mystical. People might not recall the torches, the bells, the herald's booming voice, but in repeating the gestures they kept alive an echo of that first proclamation. The law lived not only on parchment but in the hands and voices of ordinary men and women, their lives shaping and reshaping it into something familiar, even comforting. It was as though the community itself carried the law forward, like a torch passed hand to hand through the centuries, each generation adding its own breath to the flame. The strangeness of the law was hidden under layers of habit, but it was still there, waiting for anyone curious enough to peel back the history. Those who did would discover not just a legal rule but a story, a link to ancestors who stood centuries ago in smoky halls and village squares, watching the law declared for the first time. That discovery made the law more than just a relic, it made it a living reminder of how deeply the past shapes the present, even in the smallest acts of daily life. Across the centuries, the law's influence began to stretch beyond the confines of village markets and local courts, reaching into the grand halls of power where kings, queens, parliaments, and councils shaped the fate of nations. What started as a ritual meant to bind ordinary people in their daily lives was soon woven into the very language of governance. Monarchs discovered that invoking such a deeply rooted custom could strengthen their rule, adding the weight of tradition to their decrees. Parliaments and assemblies, on the other hand, sometimes used it as a counterweight, insisting that even rulers must respect a law older than their reign. Thus, a peculiar law born in a medieval hall became a tool in the great chess game of politics, surviving not because it was useful in a practical sense but because it could be wielded symbolically at moments when legitimacy was at stake. Imagine a king, seated on a high throne, surrounded by advisors and nobles, faced with rebellion or doubt. In times of unrest, words alone were not enough to hold the loyalty of subjects. The king needed to remind everyone that his authority was not merely personal, but rooted in continuity, in tradition, in something that reached back to ancestors who ruled long before him. By invoking the law, by reciting its language or staging its ritual in part, he clothed himself in history. His reign was no longer just his own, it was a link in an unbroken chain. Even his enemies would hesitate, for to challenge him now meant to challenge not just a man but the authority of centuries. This was the hidden strength of the law. It gave rulers a mantle of legitimacy that no sword could provide. Yet power is never held by rulers alone. Councils and assemblies also recognized the usefulness of the law. When they sought to limit the crown, when they wanted to remind a monarch that their authority was not absolute, they too turned to the strange law as proof. Look, they would say, even this king must bow to a rule that predates him. Even this sovereign cannot ignore the weight of custom. In this way the law became both shield and weapon, its strangeness giving it a neutrality that either side could claim. One moment it bolstered royal power, the next it armed those who opposed it. That paradox is part of why it survived. It was too useful to too many people in too many different situations to be discarded. Picture the halls of Parliament centuries later, filled with men in wigs and robes, debating fiercely over rights, duties, and liberties. A speaker rises, quoting from the ancient text, his words echoing through the chamber. Some nod in agreement, others murmur dissent, but none can deny the gravity of what he has invoked. The law is no longer a curious ritual of villagers, it has become a rhetorical weapon, a reminder that modern arguments must contend with ancient precedent. The past sits at the table, silent but commanding, shaping the terms of the debate. Even as revolutions swept across Europe, even as monarchies fell and republics rose, the law remained, its wording too deeply embedded to erase, its symbolic power too useful to abandon. The strange thing is that while people wielded it in these grand struggles, they often did so without truly understanding its origins. Kings who cited it had no memory of the torches and the bells. Parliamentarians who quoted it never stood in the smoky medieval hall where it was first proclaimed. Yet ignorance did not weaken its power. If anything, the mystery added to its strength. A law whose full origins were shrouded in the mists of time carried an aura of inevitability, as if it had always existed, as if it came not from fallible men but from the very soil of the land. That illusion of permanence gave it authority greater than any single ruler or assembly could claim. Consider also the Church, still a force in governance long after the medieval period. Bishops and clerics invoked the law as a moral anchor, proof that society was rooted in order and tradition. In sermons they framed it as part of God's will for the people, linking the rule of earthly kings to the eternal law of heaven. Even when governments shifted, even when monarchs lost their crowns, the Church's voice kept the law alive, echoing its phrases in liturgy and reminding congregations that obedience was a sacred duty. In this way, the law straddled both sacred and secular realms, binding people with cords both spiritual and political. Over time, this blend of uses gave the law an almost mythical status. It was more than just a regulation, it became a symbol of continuity, a reminder that beneath all the turbulence of war, rebellion, and reform, there were still roots that could not be pulled up. Ordinary laws were written, repealed, and forgotten, but this one endured because it had become something larger, a stage upon which rulers, priests, and lawmakers could perform their claims to authority. It had ceased to be only about daily acts and had become a cornerstone of identity, invoked to prove that a people, a nation, even a crown, had ancient legitimacy. Imagine the irony. A law that began in ritual, meant to hold together fragile communities, ended up shaping the legitimacy of entire nations. Its strange details may have seemed minor, even laughable, but in the hands of rulers and parliaments, it became a powerful reminder that the present is always haunted by the past. To discard it would have been to sever a connection with history, and few leaders dared risk that. So it passed silently through wars and treaties, revolutions and restorations, always there, always ready to be summoned when authority needed an anchor. And so the law, peculiar in its origins, lived on in the language of power. It was cited by monarchs to strengthen their crowns, by councils to restrain them, by churches to bind souls, and by parliaments to root their debates in tradition. In this way, it climbed from the marketplace into the palace, from the village square into the national stage, a reminder that even the strangest relic of the past can shape the destiny of nations if it is allowed to live long enough. By the time the law had become fully absorbed into the fabric of society, it was no longer a curiosity to those who lived under it. It was simply part of life, an unspoken presence that guided actions and decisions. And yet, as centuries passed and new generations rose, whispers of its strangeness began to resurface. Scholars, chroniclers, and wandering storytellers stumbled upon its origins, piecing together fragments from old parchments, sermons, and court records. They began to recognize that this law, so natural in daily use, had begun its journey in spectacle and ritual, born from an age of torches and chanting priests. This realization brought with it a fascination that would spread slowly through intellectual circles, as people asked themselves how such an odd remnant from the Middle Ages could still cast its shadow over the present. Picture a scholar in a dim library, surrounded by stacks of manuscripts, his candlelight flickering across the yellowed pages. He traces the same strange phrases again and again, realizing that these words he finds in medieval charters still appear in the documents of his own day. He pauses, baffled by the continuity. How could it be that a law created for a world of feudal lords, knights, and peasants was still active in the age of gunpowder, printing presses, and growing cities? The strangeness of this discovery unsettled him, but it also drew him in. For such scholars, the law was not merely an obligation, it was a mystery, a thread tying the modern age to a forgotten past. This was the beginning of its reputation as something strange and almost mythical. Ordinary people had long ceased to think about it, yet intellectuals began to describe it in lectures, letters, and treatises, turning it into a subject of debate. Was it a relic of superstition? Was it proof of the wisdom of the ancestors? Or was it an accident of history, a fossilized remnant that no one had dared to dig out? The more they asked these questions, the more the law gained an aura of peculiarity. It was no longer just part of custom. It became a talking point, a curiosity, something that travelers and writers began to remark upon when they encountered it. At the same time, its continued enforcement gave it a paradoxical quality. On the one hand, it was treated as something almost laughably outdated. On the other, it still had teeth. A merchant who broke it could still be fined. A landholder who ignored it could still lose property. A judge could still cite it as binding authority. This duality, half relic, half reality, made it stranger still. For the public, it became one of those odd facts of life that could inspire both amusement and anxiety. It was a reminder that the past was never truly gone, that even in a world of progress, old shadows still govern the present. Imagine the conversations that must have taken place in taverns and parlors. A farmer might tell a traveler that in his village, people still observed the old ritual when exchanging land, though none could explain why. A merchant might laugh about having to follow some archaic step in signing a contract, yet still comply for fear of losing his rights. A young lawyer might grumble at being forced to memorize the phrases of the law for his practice, even though he knew it came from an age long before his own. These everyday encounters kept alive not just the law itself but the sense of wonder and strangeness attached to it. The fascination deepened as Europe entered the Enlightenment, a period when reason, science, and reform took center stage. Thinkers of this era prided themselves on casting off superstition and irrational customs. To them, the law was both an embarrassment and a marvel. Some ridiculed it, using it as an example of how absurd the past had been, how chained to ritual and fear. Others, however, admired its persistence, seeing in it a symbol of continuity, a thread of stability that had outlived kings, wars, and revolutions. To dismiss it outright was to ignore the weight of history, and even Enlightenment thinkers had to admit that its survival carried a certain dignity. The law thus acquired a kind of double reputation. To reformers, it was a fossil in need of removal. To traditionalists, it was a badge of identity, proof that society was rooted in something older and stronger than fleeting fashions. This clash of perspectives only heightened its mystique. It became not just a law but a mirror reflecting broader debates about change and continuity, about the value of tradition in a world that was rushing toward modernity. Every time someone tried to abolish it, defenders rose to its aid, arguing that to tear it down would be to sever ties with the ancestors. In this struggle, the law was not simply preserved, it was redefined, not as an ordinary rule but as a symbol. By the 19th century, writers began to romanticize it. In novels, pamphlets, and lectures, they spoke of the law as a relic of a bygone age, a surviving fragment of medieval life lingering in the modern world. Some described it almost with awe, as though it were a ghost haunting the halls of power. Others mocked it, presenting it as proof of the stubbornness of human society to shed its old skin. Yet whether mocked or admired, it was never ignored. Its very strangeness gave it a place in the imagination, a role far beyond the courtroom or the village ritual. And so the law's peculiar reputation grew. It was no longer just a hidden force shaping daily transactions or political arguments. It had become a story in itself, whispered in classrooms, debated in parliaments, remembered in books. People began to look at it not only as a functioning rule but as a curiosity, a living fossil from the Middle Ages. In this transformation, the law became more than binding, it became cultural, something that belonged to the shared memory of a people. Its power now lay as much in fascination as in authority. What makes this stage of its story so striking is that people no longer simply obeyed it, they wondered at it. They told stories about it, they laughed about it, they debated it, they even felt pride in it. The law became a bridge between the world of medieval ritual and the world of modern thought, reminding everyone that no matter how far society traveled, it still carried the past on its shoulders. And in that realization, the strange law was reborn, not only as an active statute but as a living legend, a reminder that history is never truly gone, it only changes its form. As the law passed into the modern era, its presence became a paradox that fascinated and unsettled in equal measure. On one hand, it was undeniably archaic, a relic from an age of knights and clerics, yet on the other hand it remained alive, enforceable, and recognized by courts that prided themselves on reason and reform. This tension gave the law a new role, transforming it into a symbol of how the past lingers in ways that cannot easily be erased. People began to treat it almost as a living relic, a piece of the medieval world carried into the heart of modern governance, a reminder that no matter how far progress advanced, history always traveled alongside it. It was this transformation into a cultural symbol that gave the law its strange immortality, lifting it from the realm of practice into the realm of story. Imagine a courtroom in the 19th century, polished wood, rows of benches filled with spectators, a judge in robes presiding over the trial. When a lawyer cites the law, the words feel oddly out of place amid the language of modern codes and statutes, yet they command silence. Spectators exchange curious glances, recognizing that what has just been invoked is not an ordinary rule but something ancient, something older than the nation itself. The case continues, but the air has shifted, as though the past itself has entered the room. This is what made the law so powerful as a cultural symbol, its ability to carry people out of their present moment and remind them that their lives were linked to centuries of continuity. Writers and historians seized upon this quality, weaving the law into their works. Some used it to criticize society's reluctance to move forward, arguing that clinging to medieval rules showed how deeply tradition could shackle progress. Others celebrated it as a treasure, proof that modern people had not entirely lost touch with the roots of their civilization. In this way, the law's very strangeness made it useful for both sides of the cultural debate. Reformers and traditionalists alike could point to it, one as an example of absurdity, the other as an emblem of identity. It became a stage upon which larger questions about who people were and where they came from could be played out. As the law gained this symbolic weight, it began to appear outside the courtroom and the halls of power. It found its way into lectures delivered to eager audiences, into essays read by students, into novels that painted the law as a ghost of the Middle Ages haunting the present. Travelers wrote about it in their journals, amused and astonished that in a world of steam engines and telegraphs, a rule born in torchlight and ritual still held sway. For readers, it was irresistible, a story that combined history, continuity, and a touch of the fantastic. It gave them the sense that beneath the modern world lay hidden layers of the past, still shaping life in ways few fully understood. For ordinary people, the law's transformation into symbol made it something to talk about as much as something to obey. Families might speak of it at the dinner table, marveling that such an old rule still applied. Schoolchildren might learn of it as part of their nation's heritage, a curious fact to memorize and pass on. In taverns and cafes, men debated whether it was wise to keep such relics alive, or whether it was time to finally cast them aside. Its presence in daily conversation showed how far it had traveled from its medieval origins. It was no longer just a law, it was a marker of identity, something people pointed to when they wanted to feel connected to history. The law also began to serve as a kind of moral metaphor. Writers used it as an image of endurance, proof that institutions can survive upheavals if they are deeply enough rooted. Reformers used it as a warning, a way of saying that clinging too tightly to the past prevents growth. In both cases, the law became larger than itself. It was no longer simply about land, oaths, or ritual acts. It was about memory, about continuity, about the balance between tradition and change. In this symbolic form, it touched not only legal scholars but artists, poets, politicians, and citizens who might never once encounter it in practice. The strangeness of the law also inspired a sense of wonder. To live in a world where steam trains roared and telegraphs clicked, and yet know that a medieval rule still guided certain acts, was to live with a foot in two worlds at once. That duality fascinated people, for it suggested that time was not a straight line but a tapestry where past and present overlapped. The law was a visible thread from centuries gone by, running right through the fabric of modern life. That image captured the imagination, offering reassurance to some, unease to others, but fascination to all. Perhaps most importantly, the law became part of a collective story. It was something people could point to and say, "This is ours, this is part of who we are." Nations crave continuity, and in this law they found a tangible symbol of their endurance. It linked them to ancestors whose lives were so different yet whose actions still touched the present. It reminded them that identity is not invented anew each generation but inherited, carried forward, sometimes in forms as unexpected as a medieval rule still alive in modern times. And so, as the modern world surged forward with machines, revolutions, and new philosophies, the law survived not because it was practical or rational but because it had become more than a rule. It had become a story, a symbol, a reminder that the past does not vanish but lingers, shaping the present in ways seen and unseen. It was this symbolic power that ensured its survival, giving it a role not just in courts and contracts but in culture, imagination, and identity. By becoming more than law, it secured a life far longer than anyone in that smoky medieval hall could ever have imagined. As centuries turned and society moved further into the modern age, the strange law that had once been merely an obscure survival of the medieval world began to acquire new life as a tool for debate and reflection. Politicians, thinkers, and ordinary citizens looked to it not only as an oddity, but as a mirror of their own age. In a world increasingly defined by reform, by the tearing down of the old and the building of the new, this stubborn relic became something against which people could measure their own beliefs. To some it was an embarrassment, proof that the legal system was unwilling to cut ties with superstition and ritual. To others it was a comfort, evidence that stability and continuity still mattered in an era of restless change. Its endurance became more than a curiosity, it became an argument, a presence woven into the public consciousness. Think of how quickly the 19th and 20th centuries transformed society. Railways carried people across landscapes once thought vast and untouchable. Factories reshaped the rhythms of daily life. Political movements demanded the rights of workers, the emancipation of women, the recognition of freedoms that would have seemed unthinkable to medieval minds. And yet in the middle of all this urgency, all this struggle to redefine the world, there remained a law born in candlelight and ritual, still standing silently as if nothing had changed. For critics, it was a perfect example of dead weight, a chain holding the living body of society to the bones of its ancestors. They argued it mocked progress, that its very existence cast doubt on the seriousness of governments that allowed it to linger. But defenders of tradition saw it differently. They pointed to the law as a reminder that progress should not erase identity. They argued that just as people cherish monuments, relics, and ancient churches, so too should they preserve laws that testify to their history. To them, abolishing the old statute would not be a triumph of reason but an act of cultural vandalism. They insisted that every nation needs its symbols, and this law, strange though it was, had become one of them. Even those who laughed at its odd requirements often admitted that there was something stirring about the idea of sharing the same legal fabric with ancestors centuries gone. That sentiment became powerful in times of upheaval, when people longed for anchors in a shifting world. Literature, too, drew upon the law in this period. Novelists placed it into their stories as a device to show how the past lingers within the present. A character might stumble upon it in a dusty legal code, raising questions about what other medieval shadows remained alive in their world. Poets used it as an image of continuity, comparing it to an old tree still standing among new buildings, weathered but enduring. Historians explored it as evidence that no age ever entirely dies, that every moment carries echoes of what came before. In each use, the law became more than itself. It became a lens through which people could explore questions of identity, progress, and the strange dialogue between past and present. Even in courtrooms, when the law occasionally re-emerged, its effect was almost theatrical. Judges and lawyers, schooled in rational codes, would pause at the mention of it, as though recognizing that what had entered the room was not merely a statute but a voice from another world. The very act of citing it was like opening a door into the medieval mind, reminding all present that law was not born in neat modern texts but in rituals, oaths, and fears that shaped human life centuries earlier. Those moments carried with them a peculiar hush, a sense of standing on the edge of two worlds. For those who believed in the importance of memory, those moments were proof of why such laws mattered. As debates intensified, the law became almost like a character in national conversation. It was quoted in speeches, referenced in essays, invoked as proof of caution or folly depending on the speaker's position. Reformers pressed for its removal, arguing that society could never truly be modern until it shed such absurdities. Traditionalists resisted, claiming that its strangeness was precisely what gave it meaning. This tug-of-war made the law's survival even more dramatic, for every attempt to erase it only seemed to strengthen its symbolic hold. People came to expect its presence, not because they ever used it, but because they knew it was there, a reminder that the past could not be so easily silenced. Ordinary people found their own uses for it as well. It became a story parents told their children, an odd fact shared over evening fires, a way of making history feel close and alive. Travelers included it in their journals, astonished that such a rule could still exist in a world of electricity and steam. Teachers spoke of it as a way of showing students that history was not locked in books but still breathed in the structures around them. In these small ways, the law wove itself into the fabric of identity, not just as a legal oddity but as a living part of cultural memory. What is striking is that the law's practical power diminished with each passing decade, yet its symbolic power grew. Even when no case truly depended upon it, its name carried weight, its very existence enough to spark conversation. It had become a paradox, less useful in practice, more powerful in imagination. In this way, it resembled myths and legends, figures from the past that shape identity not through direct action but through the stories people tell about them. The law's strangeness guaranteed its survival because it was endlessly discussable, a thread that could be pulled in arguments about progress, heritage, and the meaning of tradition. Thus, as modernity surged forward, the medieval law did not fade into obscurity but instead stepped into a new role. It became a point of contact between centuries, a way for people to confront their relationship with the past. It was not simply a clause buried in dusty records, it was a presence that demanded to be acknowledged, whether with laughter, criticism, or reverence. And in that demand, it ensured that it would remain alive, a part of culture and identity as much as it was a part of law. Its endurance in the modern consciousness was proof that symbols can be more powerful than statutes, that memory can wield more influence than practicality. By the time the modern era reached its height, the strange medieval law had become less of a functioning tool of governance and more of a mythic presence, woven into the very imagination of the culture. It carried with it an aura of mystery that fascinated journalists, historians, and even ordinary readers of newspapers, who would stumble upon reports of its occasional mention in courts or in political debates. Each time it appeared, people felt as though they had brushed against a ghost, something impossibly old yet undeniably alive. Its survival had turned it into a story in itself, and the more society changed, the more remarkable its endurance seemed. The 20th century brought revolutions, world wars, technological breakthroughs, and philosophical transformations that altered the way people saw themselves and their societies. Yet within all this, the medieval law remained, not loudly, not in daily use, but quietly present like a whisper beneath the noise of progress. For many, it became a metaphor for the inescapable weight of history. No matter how modern humanity became, there was always something ancient lingering at the edges, reminding people that time was a circle, not just a line. In times of uncertainty, some even looked to it as a symbol of stability, proof that while machines and empires could rise and fall, there were still threads that connected the present to the deep past. Writers of this era found endless material in the law's existence. They placed it into essays as an emblem of continuity, or into novels as a reminder that the past is never truly gone. It became a kind of shorthand for the persistence of tradition, a way to evoke a sense of awe about the endurance of human institutions. For some, it was almost comical, a legal fossil surviving against all odds. For others, it was romantic, a touch of medieval mystery in a world of steel and glass. Its very ambiguity allowed it to serve different purposes depending on who invoked it. Reformers might point to it with exasperation, asking how society could ever move forward when shackled to such absurdities. Guardians of tradition pointed to it with pride, as if to say that their culture was strong enough to carry its history intact into the present. As this debate played out, the law slipped further into the realm of identity. Nations began to view it not just as a statute but as a piece of cultural heritage, something that distinguished them from others. Just as old castles, songs, or folk rituals were cherished as symbols of uniqueness, so too was this law admired for having survived the storms of history. It became part of the story nations told themselves, proof that they were ancient, resilient, and tied to the medieval world that gave birth to their modern forms. People began to speak of it less in terms of what it required and more in terms of what it represented, a transformation that ensured its survival even when its practical function was nearly non-existent. Ordinary people, hearing about it in schools or reading about it in magazines, often carried a quiet fascination for it. Imagine a student in a classroom, listening as a teacher explains that a law written down before the age of printing still holds legal force in the present. Eyes widen, not out of fear or confusion, but out of wonder. It is one thing to study the Middle Ages in books, with their knights and monks and rituals, but to be told that a piece of that world still governs them in some way is to realize that history is not locked behind glass, it breathes through the present. For many, this realization was comforting, a reminder that they were part of a chain stretching backward through centuries. The law also became useful for thinkers who wished to reflect on the nature of time. Some philosophers used it as an example of how human societies are layered, how the present never truly escapes the shadow of the past. They argued that by studying such survivals, one could better understand the deep structures of culture, the way people unconsciously carry forward ideas and customs without even realizing it. In this way, the law became more than just a curiosity, it became a symbol of memory itself, of the way civilizations carry forward fragments of their origins. Its persistence became a lesson, one that could be read as either warning or reassurance. And so, by the middle of the 20th century, the law occupied a peculiar position. It was rarely applied, and even when it was, its practical impact was minimal compared to the sweeping codes and reforms of the modern state. Yet at the same time, it was more alive than ever in the cultural imagination. It was cited in essays, remembered in classrooms, joked about in pubs, and debated in parliaments. It existed in the shared awareness of millions, not because of what it required, but because of what it represented. It was no longer a tool of governance, but a story of survival, of continuity, of the strange ways in which the medieval world still shaped the present. This transformation into myth and symbol ensured its endurance into the present day. Because it was no longer bound to its original purpose, it could not be easily discarded. Laws that are merely useful can be replaced when their usefulness fades, but laws that become symbols are harder to erase. They attach themselves to identity, to memory, to the imagination of a people. This is what had happened to the medieval law. It had slipped from the hands of clerics and knights into the hearts and minds of generations, a strange relic carried not out of necessity but out of meaning. And that meaning made it immortal. Even as the 21st century unfolded and the world entered an age of digital revolutions, satellites, and global networks, the strange medieval law continued to linger like a shadow cast across the centuries. By now its practical influence had almost entirely dissolved, yet its symbolic force remained undeniable. Journalists delighted in rediscovering it, writing pieces that startled readers with the revelation that a fragment of the Middle Ages still possessed legal recognition. Audiences, scrolling on glowing screens, reacted with the same wonder and curiosity that earlier generations had felt when hearing about it in classrooms or taverns. The law had achieved something few statutes ever could. It had transcended its own purpose and become a legend. To modern minds, this legend carried many meanings. For some, it was a reminder of the slow, patient endurance of institutions. Laws, once written, do not vanish easily. They slip through reform after reform, carried forward by inertia, by habit, by the reluctance of societies to cut ties with their past. In this sense, the law became a lesson about continuity, about the weight of decisions made long before. For others, its survival seemed absurd, even comical. They laughed at the idea that in a world of space stations and artificial intelligence, a statute conceived when knights still wore armor could still hold any power. Yet behind the laughter was an unease, for the law also whispered that the past never fully dies, and that no society can entirely escape the grip of its origins. In universities and lecture halls, professors invoked the law as a teaching tool. Students, who had grown up in a world dominated by algorithms and instant communication, listened with fascination as their instructors explained that a rule created in a world of parchment and candlelight still breathed within their legal framework. The image was almost poetic, a medieval voice speaking quietly across 1,000 years, reminding the present that it was not as new, not as severed from history, as it liked to believe. This realization often stirred reflection, even humility, for it revealed how much of modern life rests upon ancient foundations. Writers of popular culture embraced the story as well. Documentaries and podcasts use the lore as a way to explore broader questions about the survival of tradition. Novelists slipped it into their narratives, treating it as a symbol of the uncanny persistence of history. Even filmmakers found ways to allude to it, using the lore to suggest that beneath the polished surfaces of the modern world lay roots as tangled and mysterious as any medieval forest. Audiences responded to these stories because the lore resonated with a deeper truth, that human beings are never fully free of the past, and that their present is always haunted by echoes of what came before. Yet alongside fascination there was also debate. Critics argued that clinging to such relics reflected society's reluctance to embrace true reform. They insisted that the lore should finally be abolished, that its symbolic power had turned from charming to embarrassing. But each attempt to erase it encountered resistance, not only from traditionalists but from ordinary people who felt a strange affection for it. They did not use the lore, nor did they need it, but they valued it as a thread connecting them to ancestors who had lived, struggled, and dreamed centuries before. For them, its survival was not about function but about memory, about keeping alive a sense of continuity in a world that often seemed to change too quickly. This debate revealed a deeper truth about human beings, that they do not live by logic alone. A purely rational world might erase such laws without hesitation, yet people resist because they sense that symbols matter as much as practicalities. The medieval law, in this sense, had become less about governance and more about identity. It was a relic, yes, but also a mirror in which people could see their relationship with history. It asked a silent question: should the past be discarded when it no longer serves, or should it be cherished simply because it is part of the story? Each generation answered differently, yet none succeeded in making the question go away. As globalization and technology accelerated, the lore took on an even stranger aura. In an interconnected world where cultures blended and old boundaries dissolved, its persistence reminded people of their uniqueness. Nations used it as a marker of heritage, a symbol that they were not entirely swept away by the tide of modernity. It stood like an old oak on the edge of a futuristic city, incongruous but undeniably beautiful, a reminder that roots matter even when the branches reach toward the stars. And in this image lay the secret of its power. It was not merely a lore but a story that people told and retold, each time investing it with new meaning. In the quiet of night, when one reflects on the sweep of history, the lore becomes something more profound still. It is a reminder that human life is not lived in isolation, that every generation inherits burdens, treasures, and curiosities from those who came before. It shows that progress does not always mean cutting away the old, but sometimes carrying it forward in altered form. And in its strangeness lies a lesson, that the past survives in ways we do not expect, shaping us even when we believe we have moved beyond it. Thus, as it continues to exist today, the medieval lore is no longer about its original function but about what it teaches. It teaches that continuity matters, that identity is built from memory as much as from innovation, that history is not buried but alive. It endures as a whisper across the centuries, a fragment of another age that still has the power to move, to puzzle, to inspire. In that endurance, it has achieved a kind of immortality. It will likely continue to provoke wonder for generations yet to come, not because it is useful, but because it is unforgettable. In the quiet arc of history's long narrative, the medieval law reaches its final form in the present age, not as a binding statute that determines lives, but as a story that endures in memory and imagination. What makes it so remarkable is not the details of what it once required, but the simple fact of its survival. In a world that has abolished empires, erased dynasties, and reinvented nearly every aspect of daily life, this one fragment has persisted like a lone stone from an ancient temple, still standing when all else has crumbled. It survives not because of its usefulness but because it embodies something deeper, something that resonates with the human longing for continuity. It has become a vessel of memory, reminding people that the present is always built upon the bones of the past. When one reflects on its journey, the contrast is striking. It began in candlelit halls, invoked by men who believed in a world of ritual, honor, and divine order. It traveled through centuries of upheaval, through plagues, wars, revolutions, and renaissances. It was cited in courts where powdered wigs replaced chainmail, where the hum of electric lights replaced the flicker of torches. And yet, In all of these transformations, the law clung to life, adapting not by changing itself but by allowing its meaning to shift. It went from being an active command to a cultural symbol, from a rule of governance to a reminder of endurance. In this transformation lies its true power. The modern world, restless and impatient, often prides itself on shedding the past. Cities are rebuilt, languages evolve, technologies outdate themselves within years. But the law resists this pace. It stands in quiet defiance, whispering that not everything must be discarded, that some things are worth carrying forward even when their original purpose has vanished. For many, this whisper is comforting. It reassures them that they are not drifting aimlessly through history but are tied to a lineage that stretches backward through the centuries. To others, it is unsettling, a reminder that the past is never truly gone, that it lingers whether welcomed or not. Its survival also offers a profound lesson about human identity. People do not live solely in the present moment, they carry within them the echoes of generations. Customs, languages, stories, and yes, even laws, shape the way societies think and act long after their creators have vanished. The medieval law has become a symbol of this truth. It tells us that we are shaped not only by innovation but by inheritance, not only by what we create but by what we remember. It shows that memory itself can be a form of law, binding us across centuries in ways more powerful than parchment or ink. At the same time, the law's endurance raises a question: should every relic of the past be preserved, or should some be allowed to fade? This question is not easily answered, for the law shows that relics can gain meaning far beyond their original purpose. What was once a rule about land or oaths became a cultural treasure, proof of continuity, a reminder of history's strange persistence. It teaches that even when something appears obsolete, its symbolic value may yet nourish identity. In this way, the law serves as a mirror, reflecting back to each generation their own relationship with the past. Imagine someone hearing of it for the first time today. They might be struck with disbelief, perhaps even amusement. How could something so old, so seemingly irrelevant, still hold recognition? But soon that amusement turns to reflection. If this law can survive nearly 1,000 years, what else from our own age might endure long after us? Which of our creations will be remembered, and which will vanish? The medieval law provokes these questions, inviting people to see their lives not as isolated moments but as part of a much larger story. And so the strange medieval law endures, not in the clamor of courts or the weight of enforcement, but in the quiet realm of memory and meaning. It has crossed from being a command to being a tale, from being an obligation to being a symbol. It reminds us that time is not a straight road but a tapestry, where threads from centuries past still run alongside those of the present. It whispers that progress and tradition are not enemies but partners, each shaping the other in ways both subtle and profound. In the end, the law's true legacy is not in what it demands but in what it reveals. It shows that history is alive, that the past is not locked away but woven into every moment of the present. It teaches that identity is layered, built from both change and continuity. And perhaps most importantly, it offers a kind of quiet wonder, the realization that even in a world of satellites and skyscrapers, the voice of the Middle Ages can still be heard, faint but clear, reminding us who we are and where we came from. And so, as you drift into rest and let your thoughts settle into the stillness of night, let the story of this law remind you that the past is never truly gone. It lives within you, around you, shaping the world in ways both seen and unseen. Like the law itself, memory endures, and through it, you are forever connected to those who came before. And so we come at last to the final chapter of this long journey, a journey that began in the echoing halls of the medieval world and has carried us all the way into the restless heart of the present. The law that once existed as a command has transformed into something far more enduring, a reminder of how the threads of history weave through every age. Its story is not only about statutes or courts, but about people, their fears, their hopes, their desire to preserve, and their struggle to change. In its quiet persistence, this law shows us that history is not a distant land we leave behind but a companion that walks beside us, whispering in moments when we least expect it. When you think of it now, in this calm hour, it is less about its words and more about what it represents. It is the torchlight of long-vanished nights, carried into the glow of modern lamps. It is the voice of ancestors speaking across the centuries, reminding us that the choices they made, the structures they built, and the rules they crafted still live in subtle ways within us. It is proof that nothing created by human hands is ever entirely lost. Even when its purpose fades, its spirit endures, waiting to be remembered. This endurance is what makes the story of the law so strangely moving. It is a law, yes, but it is also a parable about memory itself. As we reflect on it, the law teaches something profound about time. The present often feels like a clean break from what came before, a new beginning untouched by the past. But the survival of this strange law shows otherwise. It shows that every present moment is built on layers, that the past breathes quietly beneath our steps. It shows that progress does not erase what came before but carries it forward, reshaped into new forms. It is a reminder that history does not end, it continues, flowing into the present like a river that never stops, no matter how many bridges are built above it. And there is comfort in this thought. To know that we are not cut off from the past but bound to it by invisible threads can bring a kind of peace. The struggles, the triumphs, the rituals of those who came before are not lost. They live in us, shaping the way we think, the way we govern, the way we dream. The medieval law becomes a symbol of this truth, a single surviving fragment that proves the endurance of memory. It shows us that even in a world rushing forward, it is still possible to touch the ancient, to hear the echoes of voices long gone. As night deepens and the world grows still, imagine the law not as a stern command but as a gentle story carried through time. Picture the parchment on which it was first written, the candle flames that flickered over it, the hands that preserved it, the voices that invoked it, the centuries that passed as it endured. Each moment added another layer to its existence, until finally it became less a rule than a symbol, less a burden than a reminder. And in that reminder lies its final gift, the lesson that memory is powerful, that history lives, that nothing is ever truly gone. Let this thought accompany you as you drift into sleep. Just as the law has endured across centuries, so too does the memory of all who came before you linger in the world, shaping the paths you walk. You are part of a story far older than yourself, and within that story, your life too becomes a thread, woven into the tapestry of time. The medieval law may one day finally vanish from the books, but its story will remain, carried by voices like ours, retold in whispers, remembered as proof that the past is never far. Close your eyes and let the stillness settle. The law has spoken across centuries, and now its voice grows quiet, fading into the hush of night. But its presence remains, not in statutes or courts, but in the awareness it has stirred within you, that history lives within us all, and that time is a circle where nothing is ever truly lost. In that awareness lies both peace and wonder, a reminder that you are never alone, for the past walks with you always. And as sleep carries you gently away, let that truth rest softly in your heart, like the echo of a story that never ends.